Hi there, Ali Motion from Process Evolution here. Today I'm going to walk through a presentation we gave at the Police Strategy Forum. So we had 20 minutes to talk about the 4 themes we're seeing in policing just now. So hopefully this gives you an overview of some of the key characteristics or themes that we're seeing. And I suppose the first part is, why is it useful, or why do we give this presentation to the Police Strategy Forum? So I suppose from my point of view, as Process Evolution, we're in quite a relatively unique position. We get to see a number of organisations and how policing is working in UK and Ireland. So whether it's what's going on in Gloucestershire, Gwent or Glasgow, these will be different. Each force is unique, but we see a number of themes that emerge throughout. So as I mentioned, it's a 20-minute presentation, and I want to speak to some of the issues that we're seeing within policing. I'm going to start though with an image. So that image is that of a picture, and this picture is policing through the ages. So for those of you who frequent the command corridors across the country, you'll be used to seeing things like this, whether it's in the reception in Nottinghamshire or the chief officer corridor in Hertfordshire. Lots of forces have prints that look something like this. They look at policing from on the left-hand side, the 1800s, through to the early 2000s. Now, being a proud Scotsman, I've chosen to put a print in here from the most picturesque, or what I believe to be the most picturesque force, Central Scotland Police. Now defunct, but if you look at the picture, you might see things like Stirling Castle, Wallace's Monument, and Ben Lomond out there in the distance. And before I sound too much like a Visit Scotland advert, if we take a look, we can actually see something quite different. Whistles, tunics and truncheons. It's a far cry from the high-vis jackets, the stab vests and the body-worn camera that's used today. Policing has and continues to undergo seismic change. Of the 4 areas I want to touch on, the first is very much around demand. We talk about increasing volume and a level of complexity that has been unheard of, and that's having a substantial impact on UK policing. So I'm going to address 3 different areas in which we are seeing high levels of change when it comes to demand and complexity. The first is fraud. Now, fraud cases are up by 98% in the past 10 years. It's probably no surprise if any of you got phones like me with emails streaming in, scams that are reportedly for Amazon, or those emails from that Nigerian prince promising me millions. So over the last 5 years or so, what we've seen with fraud, particularly with forces with which we've worked, is that the threshold at what constitutes major fraud or goes to the specialist fraud team has continued to rise. £25,000, £50,000 and £75,000 investigations now aren't necessarily sitting with the specialist fraud team, but are instead being dealt with by local policing. So that's neighbourhood officers, graduate investigators with few months experience, or even response officers who are carrying this caseload while doing their day-to-day job. Now, I get this. When inundated with fraud, forces face a choice, and that choice has very much been to prioritise. They've got a limited amount of resource, so they cut their cloth accordingly. Yet, when potentially large, harmful investigations are sat with the wrong officers, it does make me question the victims, the vulnerability, and what this is doing for success rates or closure rates. So the first one was fraud. The second one is serious sexual offences. And over the last decade, we've seen the number of recorded sexual offences more than triple. Now, these tend to be protracted investigations and definitely require skilled officers. In the work that we've done, we've worked with several forces, and generally when we talk about RASO cases, A rape investigation generally runs between somewhere to 80 and 95 hours of officer time. So 80 to 95 hours required to investigate a rape. So if the volumes are changing massively, that's going to have a substantial impact on the resource requirement. And that's just today. In the future, we expect things in this area to change quite markedly. What does the future hold? Well, the recommendations of Opsateria Bluestone are having an impact. We've already seen what is going to be a seismic shift. The idea of the recommendations is to put the victim's needs at the heart of the investigation. So recently we've been working with several forces to understand just what that means. What is that going to mean with the new processes? The changes that you're going to address? Does it just mean more people? Does it mean more people in different grades? Does it mean a whole change to processes? What does that landscape look like going forward? The third and final area on demand is about computer misuse. So in this case, we're not looking at a 10-year timeline, but an 89% increase in just the last 2 years. Something that forces have not necessarily been set up to deal with at this size and scale. And it keeps changing. Very few people 5 years ago would have predicted that the phrases we'd be hearing around computer misuse would be forces having to be familiar with the dark web, be au fait with the international crime networks that are taking place. And then also, even following the cash has changed. A requirement to become an almost quasi-expert in blockchain just to follow the money and the transactions. This is definitely an area in which complexity is real. These investigations, they're not 4 or 5 hours. These can span weeks and months, so it can have a massive impact on resource requirements. What we see here is three different elements of changing demand and complexity. My second point is on the workforce. Your workforce continues to change. It's fairly simple. You've had an influx of new officers through the Uplift programme, which has brought officer numbers back to levels that haven't been seen since 2011. With this increased establishment, though, comes increased pressure. Growing pains are evident in most organisations. And these growing pains fit into sort of 4 boxes. First is experience. Your new officers lack experience, both in policing but also in some case life experience. This is the generation that came out of the pandemic. Your abstraction levels tend to be much higher for new recruits. They've got protected learning and degree requirements. And we've seen double crewing rates increase substantially. In most organisations, not only have they seen influx of new officers, but as still the increase of officers or their establishment has increased, what we've not seen is a subsequent increase in fleet, which means that many organisations are having to double crew. But even if they didn't have to double crew because of probationers, training is becoming a massive issue. Training in the sense of requiring people to have blue light response driver training. It's taking months and sometimes years for people to be able to get through the queue to get their ticket. The fourth point is around supervision. With new officers, have less experience, so they require more supervision, which puts an additional burden on the response sergeants. My second point is vacancies. Hold on a second, Ali. You've just told me about all these new officers that are coming in, and now flashing up here in neon red is vacancies. What's that all about? Well, the vacancies that we tend to see are in specialist roles, armed response, public protection, roads policing, and also a dearth of detectives. Often when we talk about these things, the question goes, or what is put to me is, policing is not just a numbers game. It's about having that skills and experience too. I think that's one of the key factors in here with workforce planning is not just numbers, but also the skills and the experience to do the role. The third image is my stopwatch, and that represents process times. With this increased complexity, things take longer. That's not necessarily rocket science. An incident that used to take 40 minutes now takes 50 or 55 minutes. This is the reality of modern policing, putting additional pressure on the operation. My final image on this slide is of the revolving door. Policing used to be a job for life. Actually, scratch that. It used to be a 30-year job in which officers would come in, do the 30 years, and then ride out into the sunset. But that's not really the case these days. More and more people are coming in and leaving after 2 years. That probably makes sense. I've seen a number of people come in, they recognise that policing is not quite for them, and they leave. That's fine. But the worrying trend is those that are leaving 5 to 10 years into the job. They become disillusioned with policing, burnt out, and go off to pastures new. The issue there isn't just the fact they leave. It's that when they leave, they take with them their experience. Experience that is sorely lacking in many teams. Retention of officers is becoming a significant challenge. Now, I said 4 elements. Please humour me with what I'll call 2.5. As it does lead on, it's that question about response. BBC had a Freedom of Information request, and they asked all 43 forces in England and Wales, talk to us about your emergency response, show us how that has changed between 2019 and 2022. 43 forces were asked, 16 responded, which might be the first red flag around police responsiveness. So the way I would look at this, 2 forces, so improvement. It's Bedfordshire and South Yorkshire. 2 forces were pretty much flat, Northamptonshire and Hampshire. The remaining 12 saw a reduction, and in some cases a sizable reduction in the response performance. Now, when I started with Process Evolution 8 or so years ago, chief officers used to speak to us about wanting to have 90% of incidents attended within 15 minutes, 90% of their emergency incidents. That rhetoric has changed somewhat. That 90 has now become 85, or in some cases 80. So that to me shows that response performance at a national level is under pressure. The third characteristic is trust and public confidence. Now, I'm not going to dwell on the macro level discussions. Andy Cook summarises pretty well in the State of Policing document. What I want to talk about is the visceral, the mundane, or the more day-to-day. How often in your forces is the phrase, "someone will be with you shortly," used? Probably 50 times a day in each control room. So what does that actually mean, shortly? 2 hours? 4 hours? 12? 24 hours? It's a vague statement that appeases the victim at the time, but sets expectation levels that local policing teams don't necessarily adhere to. The victim interprets shortly any way they want, but actually local policing teams are really being set up to fail in this point if they don't respond within what the victim views as shortly. The fourth piece is about workforce. Forces are now facing more scrutiny on planning for the future. Now, I'm a data geek. I love this sort of stuff. So give me spreadsheets, better analysis, better data on workforce demand forecasting. I think it's fantastic, and there's lots of opportunities here. Now, HMIC dictates that each force does an FMS. 2 real things for me that need to happen in that FMS. Forces need to predict their future demand, and they show the tangible actions they're going to take to deal with that demand. So your force management statement is effectively what's going to happen in the next 5 years and what action are you taking to mitigate some of those results. Now, we've worked with forces, and I think it's fair to say not all have a strong grip on workforce planning. A few years ago, we worked with an armed response team that were struggling. They had high sickness rates, overtime bill that was through the roof, low morale. And when we went through the whole analysis, we found that if they'd had their establishment, they wouldn't have been perfect, but they would have been pretty good. They wouldn't have been in a bad position. But instead, they've had 20% vacancy rate. We asked them, why have you got so many vacancies in this team? Well, they'd had retirements in March, April and July, and that had led to the vacancies. So there's a question there for me about, is workforce planning helping the organisation by not backfilling or succession planning in this area? A key part of the operation is now struggling. There's also another argument here, is that it's not just about vacancies, it's about risks and skill. So we worked with one team where we looked at their investigative team and found out that in the next 5 years, 4 out of every 10 of their DCs were either going to be promoted to replace people retiring, or they themselves were going to retire. 4 out of every 10 that were in that room just now. So there's then a question there of, does your organisation understand the inherent risks by your demographics and the skills and structures? Now, this all sounds doom and gloom, but what we've seen though is that when workforce planning is done properly, our clients change their language. They talk about the 3 C's: confidence in their plans, increased levels of control, and a clarity on their strategy and discussions. In summary, I've touched on the following topics. Demand and complexity continue to increase, and I don't see that changing in any time soon. Workforces are continuing to evolve, undergoing considerable growing pains. Public scrutiny does become intrusive, but it's not going away anywhere anytime soon either. Workforce planning, understanding the uncertain future, becomes far more important, particularly with FMS in place. With Process Evolution, we've been doing this type of work for the last 18 years, and at any point in the time we're engaging with around a quarter of police forces in England and Wales. Now, before I finish, I just want to finish with this image and come back to this image and think about what the next version of this print would look like. So I'm no artist, so instead I've used bubbles here. And the bubbles sort of split into 3 areas. At the top we've got the strategic views, the force management statements, the workforce planning, the estate strategy. At a more tactical level, it's all about having the right resources by function, sizing these teams and remits. And then at the bottom, far more operational. Do we have the right shifts in place, the right shift patterns, processes, and deployment points? Now, this is the point in the presentation where I'd throw it over to questions. Obviously, this is a webinar or a recording, but if you do have any questions, please get in touch with us. From my point of view, these are the themes we're seeing in policing just now. I'd love to know if they resonate with you. I'd actually be interested as well in terms of if they don't resonate with you. Are there things we're missing here, or specific items that you're seeing within your organisation? If you want to get in touch, I'm AliMotion, ali.motion@processevolution.co.uk. Thank you.